Hello and welcome to the Socratic Forum for Thought. My name is Justin Burke, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for an event titled Socialism and Man. Today's meeting will consist of a discussion between myself and Forum co-founder Jersey Flight, to my left, on the subject of Socialism and Man in Cuba by Che Guevara. So you know what to expect. Let me explain that each of us will take about 5 minutes to make some introductory remarks, and after which there'll be a discussion lasting about 20 minutes. Following that, the floor will be open to questions and comments from the audience before we break into small groups so the conversation can continue. Che Guevara. You've heard the name, you've seen the dorm room posters, maybe you bought the t-shirt, perhaps you even had the vodka. Yes, there was a vodka. Smirnoff got sued for that one, though. What do we really know about Che Guevara, though? When I was a student, I had heard the name, I'd seen the face, not the vodka, however, but it was a while before I put the two together. I was a student in the UK for many years as an undergrad and a graduate, and there they don't say Che Guevara, they say Che Guevara, which led me to believe for a long time that Che Guevara was actually an Arab gentleman named Sheikh Uvara. Sad but true. And it wasn't until I came across the subject of today's forum that I figured it out. I was at the library and I happened to pick up a book off the shelf called Socialism and Man, and this is the book cover that I saw. This is the first time that I saw Che Guevara's name and picture in the same place. On it I saw the handsome smiling face. I read the name, Che Guevara, whatever it was, and I realized this was the person. And I went down to the ground floor to look him up in the reference section of the library, and the first thing I read about Che Guevara was that he was born in 1928 and that he died in question mark. And I wondered, how could a guy whose face was all over the place have died at an undetermined time? I had only read one line about Che Guevara, and already he had caught my attention. So the rest of my introductory remarks are going to consist of a few things that you may or may not know about Che Guevara, beginning with his name, which was not Che Guevara, or Sheikh Uvara. Does anyone know what Che's real name was? Nobody. Was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. And I was interested to see that the recently elected Prime Minister of Greece had named his son Ernesto after Che Guevara. Does anyone know where that name comes from, Che? It was actually a figure of speech, an interjection that Che would use when he was speaking with you. I've seen it translated as buddy, pal, hey you. It was something that he said and something other people said where he was from, which brings me to the second thing you may not know about Che Guevara, which is where he came from. Che is famous as a Cuban Revolutionary War hero in the 1950s, so a lot of people naturally assume that he was actually from Cuba, but he was not. Does anyone know where Che Guevara is from?
Argentina.
That's right. Che was from Argentina. He was born in Rosario on a mate plantation in 1928, as I mentioned earlier, and he attended the University of Buenos Aires, which brings me to another point, which is that we typically think of Che wearing a green army fatigues, a black beret, but he didn't come from a military background. What was Che Guevara's occupation? Does anyone know?
Doctor.
That's right. He was a medical doctor. He graduated from the University of Buenos Aires with a medical degree. And that's how he got involved with the Cuban Revolution. He met Fidel Castro in Mexico in 1955 and joined the revolutionary movement as a combat medic. He ended up becoming his own patient after he was wounded on the first day of fighting. He eventually rose to a high rank, second only to Fidel Castro, and became commander of his own column of soldiers, with whom he won the decisive battle of the revolution at Santa Clara, and the next day the war was over. In addition to being a doctor, a soldier, and military officer and strategist, Che also functioned in the capacities of an agrarian reformer, president of the National Bank of Cuba, minister of industries, a well-traveled foreign diplomat, and somehow he also found time to write numerous speeches, essays, and books. His major work was the Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, but his most famous is probably this one, Guerrilla Warfare, which is a practical step-by-step guide to fighting and, more importantly, winning a guerrilla war. It includes handy tips such as how to mix a proper Molotov cocktail and a detailed discussion of everything you need to carry in your backpack. A pipe, tobacco, a good book, yes. Extra underwear, no. A mark of inexperience, he says. Throughout his life, Che also kept many journals, including the so-called motorcycle diaries, which cover his travels around South America as a 23-year-old medical student, and which was made into a film not too long ago. The last thing I'm going to mention that you may not know about Che is what actually ended up happening to him, why his death was listed as a question mark in the encyclopedia. As noted, Che was not Cuban, and he did not remain in Cuba. He occupied various government positions there between 1959 and 1965, the year he wrote Socialism and Man, by the way. But this was also the year he decided to leave Cuba to participate in other revolutionary movements in Africa and South America. And we now know that it was in Bolivia 2 years later, on October 8th, 1967, that he was wounded in battle and captured. He was executed the next day on October 9th, which removes the question mark. And he was buried in an unmarked grave. He was 39 years old. Exactly 30 years later, his remains were discovered in Valle Grande, Bolivia, and brought back to his adopted home of Cuba. And they were interred in a mausoleum in Santa Clara, the site of his greatest military victory. At the internment ceremony in 1997, Fidel Castro asked, why did they think that by killing him, he would cease to exist as a fighter? Today, he is in every place wherever there is a just cause to defend. Jersey.
Many of you know me, Jersey Flight. I don't really enjoy introducing myself because the question is, what does one say about themselves? I think I prefer to put it this way. I'm a man who loves to think. I love the company and conversation of other thinkers. I love the freedom and movement of ideas. It is my desire and mission in life to see how far and how practically I can think before I die. Who was Ernesto Che Guevara? Allow him to introduce himself. I wanted to succeed, he says, as everybody wants to succeed. I dreamed of being a famous researcher. I dreamed of working tirelessly to achieve something that could really be put at the disposal of humanity and be a personal triumph at the same time. I was, as we all are, a child of my environment. Through special circumstances, and perhaps also because of my character, after receiving my degree, I began to travel through Latin America and got to know it intimately. I have visited, to one degree or another, all the countries of Latin America. Given how I traveled, first as a student and afterward as a doctor, I began to come into close contact with poverty, with hunger, with disease, with the inability to cure a child due to lack of resources, with the numbness that hunger and unrelenting punishment cause until a point is reached where a parent losing a child becomes an incident of no importance, as is often the case among those classes who have been dealt the heaviest blows. And I began to see there was something that seemed to me almost as important as being a famous researcher or making a substantial contribution to medical science. It was helping those people. There's a big difference between those who fight to free themselves from oppression and those who fight to retain the stronghold of their oppression. This difference automatically contextualizes the actions of those involved in a revolution. The axiom of a revolutionary, the beginning of all great men, of all great women, is that they care for the well-being of other people. Without this vital precept, there can be no revolution. Without this vital precept, there can be no social progress. Society, in order to exist, must have a foundation of unity. After the examples of Gandhi and King, it is easy to see that any great man, that any great woman will be judged by how much she cares. Love is the energy which creates the power of a revolutionary life. Che Guevara, to use the phrase of Nietzsche, was no man, he was dynamite. But where exactly did his power lie? Did it lie in the sophistication and the maneuver of politics? Did it lie in an ability to control and manipulate people? The power of Che was his desire to serve the people, to help the people, his desire to be equal with the people, his courage to move toward the realization of a better world. But most of all, it was his strength to love, his authentic ability to perform the act of love. Here was no hypocrite. Here was no pretender. I am left in total awe of this man. The only thing I can do is ask myself where he came from and how men like him are made. When I study the life and thought of Che, I don't find the evil character that has been manufactured by a dishonest and insecure media. I find a figure of beauty who did the best he could, who did all he could to make the world a better place. Ladies and gentlemen, this man did something perhaps we can never do. He denied himself power even when it was his to take. And because of this, it is hard for us to understand the ethos of a man like Che. The vast majority of men are motivated by power. They act for the sake of obtaining power in order to reign over other men. But Che was the opposite of this kind of man. He was a man that sought to destroy the infrastructures of power in order to bring about freedom and equality. When he had the choice to rule, instead, he thought it right to serve. Some men reach for power their entire lives. For these men, the climax of existence is how comprehensively they can control other people. All that they do to increase their power. But there are other men, the rarest of all human beings, those who bloom on the cliff. They put forth their flower, not to control, not to seduce the traveler who is passing by, but to selflessly increase and heighten the quality and awareness of his existence. There are those who give of their own existence purely for the sake of enhancing the existence of others. These men and women thrive only when other people thrive. Such persons are rich in themselves, deep in the vault of the integrity of their being, so much so that they seek to build up the weak spots in humanity. This is precisely the greatness of a man like Che. He could have taken power. He could have lorded over other people. He could have asserted himself. He could have exploited ignorance unto his own advantage, but instead, he sought to educate, to build up the vital center even at the total cost of himself, because he knew that the only world worth living in is a world of solidarity. Or as he put it in a touching letter to his children, each of us, taken in isolation, is worth nothing. Ernesto Che Guevara was only 39 when he died. And in that short time, he had completed his degree in medicine and won liberation for the Cuban people. How old are you? When will you die? What have you done in your time? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad that you read that you began with that passage where Che is talking about why he gave up medicine, why he originally got into medicine, and why he gave it up for something else, because it's his parents were very proud of him as a medical student, and they saw his future in medicine. And after the revolution, they hadn't seen him for over 2 years, and they came to visit him in Cuba. And I read, it was either an interview with him or with his father, who said that, who'd asked him, well, when are you going to finish with this revolution stuff and get back to your medicine? They thought that he would actually go back into some kind of practice after the revolution was won in Cuba, that he'd come back to Argentina and be a doctor.
Like a phase he was going through.
Right, and that was not to be. I wanted to start our conversation here at the end of Che's paper, actually, near the end of Socialism and Man. And there's a surprise that he has for us, I think. It really comes it's very unexpected way of writing and what he says there. I'm just going to read a couple of lines. He says, "At the risk of sounding ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. It is impossible to think of an authentic revolutionary lacking this quality. One must have a large dose of humility, a large dose of a sense of justice and truth. We must strive every day so that this love of living humanity is transformed into actual deeds, into acts that serve as examples as a moving force." And that comes at the end, but I think that's his attitude throughout the piece.
Yeah, I would comment on that too. He goes, because he actually defines the nature of this love when he says, this is a love of the people, which I think is a very beautiful phrase there, a love of the people. And an interesting contrast I notice here, he says, he goes on to say, of the most sacred causes. When we think of the term sacred, we think in terms of religion, people making things in religion sacred. But it's interesting, he's the true quintessential humanist in this sense, because for him, sacredness is the cause of the people. It's the society. It's the organization, the organism that he's part of, which I think is totally appropriate.
It definitely shows his motivation. I think whatever you think of the results of his activities, I always come back to these, to remarks like this. This paper he wrote in 1965, that was the last year he was in Cuba, and this is generally regarded as his last official writing. He wrote a lot of journals and diaries after this, but this was the last thing that came out, and it really sums up a lot of his ideas. I mean, we have to think of it as one of the late works of Che Guevara, but considering that he died at 39, pretty much all his writings would be the early writings of Che Guevara. Yeah. But in this one, he's trying to sum up everything up to this point.
I want to say more on this idea of love that he brings forth, because at the end of that little section there, he says, if one's revolutionary zeal is blunted when the most urgent tasks have been accomplished on a local scale, and one forgets about proletarian internationalism, which, to just put it in very simple terms, he's referring not to a sectarian nationalism, but he's referring to this idea of a one world unification.
Wasn't that interesting that it was in this year? Because this is the year that he decided to leave Cuba, to give up his government position, to give up the Cuban citizenship he had been given, and to go do what? To get rich quick? No, to join another revolution in Africa.
Yeah. He wins the Cuban Revolution, and then he goes and joins another revolution. It's really hard to comprehend the strength, the determination of a person like this. This idea here that he puts forth at the end of this love of living humanity here, where he talks about this, that this love cannot just be confined to a particular nation, but that it has to branch out, and that we have to think of the human race as opposed to the American culture, our the English culture.
The phrase he would often use was "our America," and we here in the United States we think, well, that's when we say America, that means us. But to him, that meant Latin America, it meant South America, it meant Central America. To him, our America was many different countries speaking many different languages. In fact, the word Che, that I had seen that some people think that came from a Guarani. That was like a South American Indian word, and it's something he had picked it up in his travels. And since it was so unusual, that's why people started calling him that, because they didn't hear a lot of people saying that word.
I think another neat thing about this, when he talks about this internationalism, he says this is the way we educate our people. Educate them not so that they're just concerned with their own specific geography, but concerned with making the world as a whole a better place.
Because I think most people are not really thinking of, how are my actions influencing not just myself, my family, my community, my country, but the whole world, the whole international community?
Yeah.
His idea, he was one of the founders of this group called Tricontinental, and his ultimate strategy was to link all the countries of South America, all the countries of Africa, with the countries of Southeast Asia, the Soviet Union. So there would be a huge movement incorporating 3 continents. in cooperation.
The thing that stands out in this essay to me the most, if summing up what is the essence of this essay, is the individual. And from the very beginning, he deals with
it
this.
Up on the first page.
Yeah. You have the quote there?
A common argument
yes.
from the mouths of capitalist spokespeople is the ideological struggle against socialism is that socialism is characterized by the abolition of the individual for the sake of the state. And he brings that up right in paragraph number 1.
Yeah, that is great, because that is the capitalist objection to socialism contained right there in a nutshell. Is they want to claim that it destroys the individual, that if you go down the socialist road, that the individual no longer has any place in society. And then we see Che all throughout this essay. So he says that the individual was the basic factor of the revolution, which is, I think that's a very interesting way that he defines him.
I think he means they're different. Like that, he's talking about what he called the vanguard. Like there are particular people, probably himself included, who were examples for others, other people who were in the military component, other people in the social movements, that they all had to follow the example of individuals, so that it presupposes there being individuals. Like you can't even imagine socialism without individuals. If everyone were abolished in favor of the state or absorbed into a state.
I've gone through here, I've noted the places where he brings up the individual that are significant, and under the individual in socialism, he says, I think the place to start is to recognize the individual's quality of incompleteness, of being an unfinished product. Now, this is a very important point, I think, that he makes, and the reason is because that is precisely the response to the capitalist objector, is that, no. You misunderstand the nature of an individual. An individual can't be anything without the context of society. He's got to have a hole there from which he can be built up from and become that individual thing. And I think I like this word that he uses, this incompleteness, because the capitalist tries to come in and talk as though the individual is just automatically complete all on his own. He's just autonomous from the ground up. Everything that he is, he made himself what he is. And Che recognizes here that no, the place to start in attacking this is to notice that the individual is incomplete by himself.
Well, and just above that, he says that the individual has a dual existence as a unique being and as a member of society. That you have to look at both of those aspects. That socialism doesn't just look at one, it's your role in society.
Yes.
And it has to acknowledge that that society is made up of unique beings, as he calls them here.
There's a few more things I wanted to...
I like this, in this same section here, just a little below it, he says that the society in which they exist, like even though the revolution has been successful in Cuba, but they still are, society hasn't been abolished. It's still there, as a framework, as a foundation. And he says the residue of an education system, systematically oriented toward isolating the individual still weighs heavily. It's still there. That the people who are there, they've been brought up in a capitalist society, they've learned this in school, they still have the residue of that education. And that's why he's talking about education throughout this. He talks about the new man, the new woman, and a project he didn't think would be achieved even in the 20th century. He talks about the new man and woman of the 21st century, people who had a social consciousness, that internationalism, whatever it was, all the elements or the ideals of socialism wouldn't really permeate throughout society until sometime in the 21st century.
This is another quote that on this same topic that goes with what you're saying, is he says, and this is really the linchpin, I think, in capitalist society, individuals are controlled by a pitiless law, usually beyond their comprehension. And the point that I want to draw out from this is the capitalist thinks that he is free, he thinks that he is an individual, he thinks all these things, but he does not know that he's actually the product of this law. That, and more importantly, the capitalist exists in a capitalist matrix in which they do not comprehend this idea that they are actually subverted by the motions of capitalism so that they can't even be a real individual.
As if capitalism somehow were post-ideological, that the end point of economic and social history had been reached, that it's true for all time, it will never change, that somehow it's above and beyond an ideological position. Because when you grow up in it, when there isn't even anything proposed as an alternative, it's like the air that you breathe, and it's hard to see outside. That's why I think Che says he puts such a long-term view on it, that it's going to take, he wrote this in the 1960s. He said it wouldn't be until the 21st century that people were able to appreciate this point of view. Fully. It would take that long to deprogram society or reprogram it.
His statement is that the individual under socialism is more complete. He's more complete because the capitalist thinks that he has equality, but there's not equality in capitalism, because capitalism is a system that is propagated and pushed by monopolies that can't be prevented because of the structure of capitalism. And because of that, there is not an equality. And so a person cannot be a true individual under a capitalist system.
He says that, and this is a very idealistic point of this paper here, but he wrote, the individual will reach total consciousness as a social being, which is equivalent to the full realization as a human creature.
Yes.
So he's equating
Yes.
humanism with socialism. He says this will occur once the chains of alienation are broken.
Yeah.
That's another theme that runs throughout this paper.
Definitely. When I look at this paper, because I used to be a capitalist, so I think of it in terms of how the capitalists might be thinking about this paper. So that's where I'm kind of coming from, just so you know. And when I hear that, I immediately think of the capitalist mindset, which is to just say, well, alienation doesn't even exist. It's not even a real thing.
Because it's all free choice, right?
Yes,
We're all
yes.
No one's physically coercing us to go to engage in this in capitalist practices in a capitalist system. If you don't like it, leave. As if that were a possibility.
So when he brings that point up, immediately that's what the capitalist is thinking, that there is no such thing as alienation. Well, that's because this idea of alienation, the capitalist thinks of it in a very limited sense. They think of a problem in a system as being just physical coercion of some sort. But there is such a thing as economic coercion. There is such a thing as other forms of coercion. There is such a thing as exploitation. He says that the results of a capitalist movements, basically, that's not his, but this is his quote, is they live only so long as the individual who inspires them, or until the harshness of capitalist society puts an end to the people's illusions. And I think this happens precisely because these movements, these capitalist movements, are for the sake of the individual. They do not have an effect of equality involved in them. It's simply for an individual at the top of a pyramid to keep on gaining his more and more accumulation of the product of wealth.
I don't know if you want to move on from alienation yet, but I like how one of the means of getting out of this, of becoming disalienated, you could say, is through art and culture.
Yeah, let me just say a few more things about alienation, because I want to drive this point home, and then we can drive the point home of alienation in that realm too. He says more here about the laws of capital, which are blind and are invisible to ordinary people, act upon the individual without he or she being aware of it. That is exceedingly important. He stresses this over and over again, and you brought this up a little while ago. This indoctrination that one is raised in like a capitalist society, and therefore your thinking is in light of a preset channels. It's these preset channels that you have been taught to think, and you've been taught to see the world this way. This is the capitalist matrix. And he says these people are blind, they're invisible to ordinary people, they don't know that they're enslaved. They don't know. And remember, he goes on to say, talk about the Rockefeller.
That's the point I came to right here.
Okay, great, yeah.
That it was a myth, that this is the myth of the self-made man, the myth of freedom, the myth of opportunity, that, and I thought it was interesting that he picked up, he mentions by name John Rockefeller, who was, I believe, the richest man in world history, and someone who became rich on a natural resource, what we would call a natural resource, something that he didn't really invent, something that is just found that really should belong to all people, or belong to at least to the people who come from where this natural resource was found.
Yeah.
And someone who did it in an illegal way, through a trust that had to be broken up, through illegal monopolies, through means he did through unfair competition.
Yes.
And Che uses this as an example. His word for it is depravity. That to amass this kind of fortune, he says, what amount of depravity was entailed in the accumulation of a fortune of such magnitude? This is always left out of the picture.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's just an excellent point that he makes there, polemical point. And the point is, in simple terms, is that in order for someone to amass a large quantity of money, many people have to suffer. The term depravity. Yeah.
One can win only at the cost of the failure of others.
There we go. A contest among wolves. The very essence of capitalism itself is completely set against the very essence of society. The essence of society is cooperation. That's what the essence of society is, cooperation. The essence of capitalism is a contest among wolves. It's dog eat dog. You can't have a society if you have that at the foundation as the base. So you have to have something that transcends this, that takes people beyond this primitive attacking of each other, winning only at the cost of the failures of others.
And he also says when that occurs, like when people start believing that PR or whatever, that story that capitalism tells about itself, his line is the workers in imperialist countries lose the spirit of working class internationalism. That they don't feel connected to each other. They're alienated from their work. They're alienated from other workers. They're alienated from other countries. That there's no impetus to even think of a workers' movement locally or internationally.
Yeah, and as he argues in this, because capitalism turns individuals into commodities. And I was thinking about this, and I thought, commodities. I thought, well, it turns individuals into commodities. They don't own themselves. They're now the property of someone else. Someone else actually owns them. Someone else dictates to them. Someone else has them labor for their benefit. And all of the social benefit, all of any type of higher solidarity is completely removed from the process.
What did you think about, he's talking about the commodity as the economic cell of capitalist society, and he says it has effects on organization, production, and consequently in consciousness. That it's not just a social or an economic reality. It has a direct effect on consciousness, the way you think about yourself and about other people, about your time. He says that you every day for 8 hours a day you're dying at your job because you're not living fully. That's the problem. One of the problems with alienation. What effect it has on our consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's quite a profound point that he makes. Another point that he makes on this of the indoctrination that enslaves people into this alienation to spout an ideology that this is actually a good thing. It's a moral thing. That's what they're putting forth. He says that this indoctrination, this education, lulls the masses since they see themselves as being oppressed by an evil against which it is impossible to struggle. This is what is really important to me in the context of revolution, is that revolutionaries that are thwarted by a capitalist ideology means that they think that there's no point in trying to fight against this machine. And that is instilled by the very capitalists who control the situation in the first place. They're pushing this idea. And
it's part of the mythology. It's the story capitalism tells about itself, and it tells it to capitalists, and it tells it to other people who might be against capitalism. Like don't even waste your time trying to. It's like trying to live without breathing or something. To live without the capitalist air that we breathe.
It's sowing despair, so they can then reap the benefits of that fatalism for their own gain.
I think we've only got about 5 more minutes before we open it up, but and if we want to talk about the art thing, I thought
yes,
it was
I want
interesting.
to. I do. Yes, it's very important.
I was impressed to see that Che is very critical of what had become the communist or socialist tradition in visual art. Do you want to hold? We have some representations here. This is, this is what you would see, socialist realist painting from, I've got China here, Jersey has, I think, the Soviet Union. This was my favorite, actually. I thought this is from North Korea. Here's dear leader Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il, surrounded by the children here in different costumes and dressed up as sailors and soldiers.
Propaganda.
And Che makes a point that this is not only it's not only bad art, it's bad education. It doesn't, if the art itself isn't revolutionary, if it's not interesting as art. I mean, if this painting wouldn't have been made if it didn't show the dear leader and his son and all these children here. It's merely a propaganda piece. It's called socialist realism, but to me, I think that word is incorrect. It's not really realistic or naturalistic. It's social idealism.
Yeah.
It's an idealistic form of art, which makes it even less interesting. That there's not really anything worth looking at visually in the image.
Yeah, I think I can reiterate what you're saying, and same thing, just in maybe different terms to even try to drive it home even more, is that Che in this essay says that the way to go about socialism is not to copy capitalism. That's a mistake. And likewise, in the realm of art, it's a mistake if the artists try to simply rebel against the bourgeois forms of art and then adopt this socialist realism. That's a problem.
That's another. Yeah, that's an additional point where this kind of style, this so-called naturalism, does come from the 19th century academic style. This would be a painting similar to this style would be shown in the annual salons where the artists were trying to sell their works. I mean, literally, they were commoditized. And they would have an annual exhibition, and you would try to get your painting bought by some member of the aristocracy, the royal family, by a museum or gallery or something like that. And it was almost always done like this. You couldn't tell who had painted it just by looking at it because there was almost no individuality in style.
Yeah. This reminds me of what he says in that section on aesthetics, and that is that the artist in the capitalist structure is actually not free to be a true artist in the capitalist structure, precisely because they have a hierarchy within what is acceptable, what will be promoted, what will be celebrated, and if you don't conform to that ideology, the capitalist ideology, in other words, you can't use art as protest. You can't, and you think he says that in there, you can't have revolution, this type of stuff, because it cuts against the grain, the consensus of.
Well, that would be the critique of it in capitalist terms, but also like if we look at the socialist, this is the People's Republic of China, and if your artwork didn't look like this, they all looked like this.
Yeah.
They weren't painted by one person. There were hundreds of artists, and they were all painting in the same style, which was indistinguishable one from the other.
So he once again is emancipating and protecting and contextualizing this idea of the individual, even in the aesthetic realm,
which is pretty advanced,
Yeah.
especially for a socialist, someone who's meant to be cooperating with Russia and China. In saying the art that is sanctioned by the state. It was 1934, and this style really dates to 1934 in the Soviet Union when it was adopted as a state style, and it was exported to China and any other country that was trying to adopt socialism or communism.
There's two really important things I want to touch on before we,
Sure. I think
if you have something, because it's super important on this art idea, because I think if this comes home to people, it makes a really strong point. He says, for a long time, individuals have been trying to free themselves from alienation through culture and art. While a person dies every day during the 8 or more hours in which he or she functions as a commodity during the workday, individuals come to life afterwards in their spiritual creations. But this remedy bears the germs of the same sickness, that of a solitary being seeking harmony with the world. One defends one's individuality, which is oppressed by the environment, and reacts to aesthetic ideas as a unique being whose aspiration is to remain immaculate. It is nothing more than an attempt to escape. This idea, to me, is one of the most important ideas he brings up, because, to me, he closes the exit doors for the artists, and he basically says, you have to confront this idea of expression you have in you. Is your expression, is your act of art, is it a lament? Are you crying out that you're trapped in this capitalist society and that you can't break free from it? Because if that's the case, your art is not free. You are not actually a free artist. You can only be free when you get outside of that superstructure. You have real freedom, you have real individuality, and then you can actually begin to express yourself. He doesn't allow any means of getting out of this. He says that the paths, however, had already been more or less laid out, and the escapist concept hid itself behind the word freedom. This means the artist begins to say to himself, in my creation, I am free. And Che is saying, no, that word freedom is camouflage for escape. You're trying to break out of this oppressive society. You're trying to break free from your alienation that capitalism is imposing upon you. And you're using this word freedom to make yourself feel better about it. But in reality, it's actually escapism.
He calls it, at the end of that section there, the invisible cage, right? That you say, like your image of freedom, your image of whatever it is, your artistic ideas and experimentation, it's all a sham. It's an invisible cage if that's the only outlet you have for this. If it isn't real in the world, if it's only real in your art, if it becomes an image of the freedom that doesn't really exist, then that is just as bad as these pictures, right?
Yes,
Socialist realism.
Yeah, and I wonder how many of us actually are aware of this and conscious of this. How many people in society think in these terms, artists, musicians, what is the economic, the social expression of one's art? Do we ask ourselves this question ever? Because I think it might lead to some very interesting conclusions.
I think a lot of people think it functions the way Che is saying, that I don't like my job, I don't like my life, but I have this release in my artwork or whatever. And to Che, that's the worst use of art. That's the worst thing you could put it to.
Yeah, because it doesn't actually escape the oppression of the infrastructure.
No, it just makes the alienation and the exploitation tolerable while you have a fantasy life that exists in an ideal image.
Yeah, he even says that, to sum up, the fault of many of our artists and intellectuals lies in their original sin. They are not true revolutionaries. They're not broken out of that oppression, that infrastructure that is...
Either they're living vicariously through the image of freedom, or they're trying to create some kind of original commodity. It's the art world is just as much of a rat race as anywhere else, perhaps even more so, because there's so many people trying to get into it, and so many spaces for people who have a recognizable and marketable style.
Yeah. I want to say something about
what did we leave
dogmatism. I want to say something.
That's right, but that's the last section.
Yeah.
We might as well end with that.
Before because the capitalists would be prone to talk of the dogmatism of socialism, or this religion of socialism or something, which is a joke. But Che actually has this section where the danger of dogmatism, where he points this idea out of becoming too rigid, of not keeping an open mind. And he also defines, I think, what a revolution is very clearly in that section as well.
He ends with this list of saying that we are, as socialists, we are freer than the capitalists who say that they embrace freedom.
Yeah.
That we are more fulfilled. That complete freedom and liberation is what their freedom, not only from capitalism, but also from imperialism, from alienation, from exploitation, from all of that. That's possible, he thinks, with socialism. It is not. Yeah. That's the mythology, the ideology, the myth of capitalism.
I'll just quote from him on what he says. A revolution is, that's my part in it, his quote is, a solid structure of individual beings moving toward a common goal, men and women who have attained consciousness of what must be done, people who fight to escape from the realm of necessity and to enter that of freedom. Who would not want to be a revolutionary if this is the definition of what it means to be a revolutionary?
I think so. I think we should open it up.
Yeah.
Who's got a question? Fireman.
In the beginning, you were saying something about the white-hot precept, and what is your white-hot precept? But you said the white-hot precept twice. What I didn't...
Concern for other people.
Okay.
Yeah, concern.
I'm just curious, you guys seem to know a lot about this, what your opinion is of this man.
Of what?
What your opinion is of what you wrote.
Of
Do you agree with what he said?
I agree with the vast majority of what he said. I think that I put it this way: any educated, when we educate ourselves and we become conscious of the infrastructures that we're part of, it's not that the question of whether or not we move in the direction of socialism is itself in question. That's not. We don't. This isn't something that we go, well, should we move in the direction of socialism? No. The question becomes, how do we move in the direction of socialism? It's not an issue of whether or not we should move in that direction. That direction is an inevitability. We have to move in that direction because the very basis of society is cooperation itself. You take that away, you have dog eat dog, you destroy the whole concept of society itself. I think that he makes so many excellent points.
I think we can accept his criticism of capitalism. I don't think it's a question of is it right or is it wrong. It's what do we do about that, about the results of this critique.
I would say this about a place that I differ with him, but this was never meant to be an end. This essay, he never meant this to be the final document of dogma for socialism. That's not what it is. He was doing the best he could.
In fact, several places throughout, he says we might be mistaken, we go down the wrong road, we have to go back, we have to start over. It's very candid in places. Because I noted it was several places where he mentioned.
Oh, he says we've made mistakes, we make mistakes. And the one point that he actually helped me to get the strongest grasp of social theory that I have obtained in the entire context of my life, it comes from this essay. And it comes from what he says in here about the relation of the state to the people, that there must be this intimate connection, that the leaders must represent the will of the people. He says in the very beginning that what emerged in the revolution was this phenomena of the mass, these people. So what I learned from him is I learned that if you're going to move forward into any type of social structure, you can't just have this idea very loosely between officials and the citizens. You have to have an infrastructure in place that empowers the voice of democracy, the citizen, and allows them not to be taken over by forms of fascism, by forms of despotism. And he was aware of these things. He knew that these things could occur. If you read his writings, you'll see he's always trying to guard against it. The thing is, he was a man of goodwill. He was a man of, you might even say, good faith. He believed in the masses, in their ability to liberate themselves. And so he just, says this is the way it should be, this transparent relationship, and not perhaps thinking in terms that corrupt men can come in and exploit that integrity there. And so that is, I think, what I learned of really great importance from him.
Well, my question then would be, so we're moving in a direction towards something, socialism. I only get through about 2/3 of it, and maybe specify more about what that was. I mean, I feel like I think I have some idea what it was, but I didn't really hear him say it. And then also, who determines what that is? I mean, you say he has this connection with the people, the mass, but how?
I think it's.
Thinks he has it?
Well, I think it's at a very basic level in Cuba. I mean, Che Guevara had never been to Cuba before the Cuban Revolution, and he spent 2 years there in the mountains and in the towns before the revolution ended. And he said that in his journals he was amazed by the lack of education, that I think only 40% of the people could read, that they were subsistence farmers. That means you grow it, you eat it. If you don't grow it, there's no surplus, you don't eat anything. That there were no schools. So it's not like, well, should we spend all this on building new airports or luxury hotels? No, it was at such a basic level of trying to get electrification, water, sanitation, schools, education, that kind of thing. So you ask, how does he know what the people need or what they want? I think it really was a matter of what they needed rather than what they wanted.
Because he came in and said, oh, you guys were deprived, this is what you need.
Well, he ended up being one of the deprived ones as well. I mean, he lived for 2 years. I mean, they didn't have separate supplies from the people. That when they got to Cuba, the band of revolutionaries that Fidel put together, there were about 20 of them that started the what they call the vanguard. The rest was the people who joined them. They didn't go in there with an army of 1,000 people. They went in with 82 people. They were ambushed. I said Che Guevara was wounded on the first day, and there were about 20 people left after that, and that was the core.
So
That's in the manual guerrilla warfare, by the way, too. He says that you can't wage a guerrilla war if you don't have the cooperation of the people. If the people aren't going to join you, then you shouldn't bother going.
So yeah, all these people joining in, and together they just kind of figure out, well, this is where we need to go. We need to give people all these services.
Well, he says that there's two pillars of the construction of socialism in this essay. He says there's two pillars: the education of the new man and woman and the development of technology. Those are the two things that it's founded upon, is the educating and the building up. Now, Dr. Burke can tell you, he knows this better than I do, but the largest literacy movement that ever took place, so far as I know, in the history of the world, was one that took place in Cuba. And do you remember how many students went across the countryside?
It was a few thousand.
It was thousands of students went across the countryside after the Cuban Revolution, and they basically wiped out illiteracy there, because he keeps on emphasizing this idea of education, education. Now, you contrast that with capitalism, you're not going to get that. Capitalism wants to indoctrinate individuals to the point where they're signing their own death warrant, basically, to where they have this, they're feeling sorry for their captors, they're praising their captors. This is not the case in Cuba. You have them trying to emancipate the people, make them aware of social conditions and all this stuff that's going on. That's quite an extraordinary...
If you wanted to continue exploiting them, I don't think you'd be educating them.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, that would be a mark, that would go again. It's more likely to backfire than aid you in exploitation.
Well, maybe these guys were good guys and they educated the masses just the way that they needed it. But I get the feeling that there's a lot of places that push socialism, communism, whereas they have their own ideas about how people need to be educated, and it's full of propaganda, which is very favorable towards themselves, and they block out a lot of outside.
Well, I mean, if we look at this, you can't see the little details here, but these three red objects, these are Mao Zedong's book of quotations, right? They're holding they're in the vanguard here, and every person is holding up a little red book. So maybe you're thinking something like that, where it really is indoctrinated. Here's the book. Everyone read it. You have to memorize it. Actually, I quite like Mao's book of quotations. I think it's full of fun little phrases and things.
But Che says the way that they educate the people in there. He says that they teach this internationalism, that there's one world. There's not tons of divided worlds. That it's one race, not tons of different races. He says this is what we teach our people. He says this is the way we educate our people. And this comes after what he talks about with love, too. Now, I don't deny that people could twist these things and use them for tyrannical purposes, for controlling purposes. Evil men have done this all throughout history. But in this case, in this essay with Che, we're not dealing with it here. And that's what I was saying, that is what I learned from him, is that...
But he never had power, so how do we know? See, the feeling that I got when I was reading this was, here's this guy who thinks that he knows what's best, and he wants to go in and tell people where we need to go, what we need to do. But maybe he's a really good guy and he does all the right things. I think there are a few people out there who have taken control, who have done that. But I think generally it's a slippery slope. And so somebody gets power and they start thinking, well, I'm in control, I know what's supposed to be, how things are supposed to be done, and they start gradually, they decide they don't like contrary ideas, people who don't agree with them, and then, at some point they just start killing those people off. I think that's happened very often. And that, I guess, is kind of what my feeling about what he's saying and about socialism is that it's necessarily authoritarian because somebody has to make that decision about...
Well, if it wouldn't be... if it's democratic, though. So it's the will of the people. A true socialism is a democracy.
How he got those ideas about what the people wanted?
As soon as you affirm the defined society, the conclusion of cooperation automatically follows. It's actually not complex at all. As soon as you define what a society is and you define it as cooperation, I mean, it's kind of simplistic even.
How did he get all that?
An example of this.
Wasn't
someplace in world history where this has happened?
I don't know much about the history of the Cuban Revolution, but wasn't it in the context of the Batista dictatorship.
Yes.
And the country was partially occupied by U.S. capitalists, and that was, so you had extreme inequality of wealth. And
Well, it wasn't just that, it was organized crime. I mean, if you remember Godfather 2, a lot of that movie takes place in Havana. It actually takes place on the eve of of Che Guevara's victory, because they're at this New Year's Eve ball, and that was the last day of the revolution, when the mafia had to get out. This was a big threat to them. And there was prostitution, gambling, illiteracy, all these, I think I rattled off a list earlier of things that Che saw, that he experienced personally after he got to Cuba, and was surprised to see the conditions under which a lot of people were living.
yeah, I remember talking to a guy from Colombia who knew something about it. He said that under Batista, conditions were so bad you could buy a young girl's body for a couple bowls of rice.
Well, there you go. Yeah,
People were
the
extremely poor.
capitalist conditions also lead to his conclusion as well, because they lead their exploitation, alienation, all these things exist in a capitalist system. So they automatically lead in this direction with people. That's just the way people evolve socially. You can't. Everyone here has played the game Monopoly. Monopoly would never work in the real world. It's impossible, because you would see people getting evicted, and women and children, and there's vast exploitation. It just doesn't work. So you only have one person winning at the top. Well, the people at the bottom, the only thing you can do is keep them ignorant and not let them understand what's going on. The more ignorant you keep them, the better off it is. The more aware they become, then they say, wait a second, why do all these people on the top have all the money? We're at the bottom doing all the work. We have nothing. This doesn't make any sense to us. And then naturally you already have the groundwork for revolution, as Marx called it, from the internal contradictions of capitalism itself.
It sounds to me like you're talking about capitalism, but you're also kind of including democracy in that. Because, like with your example there of these people are getting evicted, they're the majority, right? So how is it that this minority who owns these buildings can do things that they don't want when they're the majority?
Because they submit to the oppressor. That's what happens in capitalism.
Democracy, right? So why don't they just make a law and say, well...
Capitalism is not democracy. Capitalism is not democracy. It can't be democracy, because you have an accumulation of wealth. And when you have an accumulation of wealth, you have money that buys the power. And when you have money that buys the power...
So you're saying that the problem is not democracy, because you like democracy.
Yes, there is no problem.
Capitalism.
Yes.
It seems like democracy is political rights, so that's more fundamental. So the problem is with democracy, not with capitalism. Because if the problem was, you're saying the problem is democracy because these economic entities are able to control the democracy. So then the democracy is broken.
Well, you can't have democracy in a capitalist system. You simply can't have it. It's not possible to have it when you have the accumulation of wealth, because the money buys the power.
The economic system breaks the political system.
Correct.
I think that the political system is more fundamental. So if the capitalists are able to control the political system, then the political system is broken. Because the people, if they're the majority, if it's democracy, they should be able to control the minority.
But you assume that the democracy is conscious of the condition, see? That's the assumption behind what you're saying. You assume that they have this consciousness so that they're actually able to make an informed decision. There is no equality in a capitalistic system. It's dog eat dog. And when you have a system like that, you're not going to have the same active education distributed equally. You're going to have, and people exploit it. The very basis of capitalism is exploitation. That means exploitation on every single level that you can get it on. Education, everything. We should go to a different question.
We got some people, in the back there. I see you've been waiting.
Okay. Where to start? I was curious as to what this was going to sound like when I got here. Amazing. I think that we're standing here in the most successful nation in the world, capitalistic system, that is a democracy.
It's debatable.
Well, by any
Education.
measurement,
Well, we'll let him ask his question.
Yes.
Okay, excuse me.
People in this country choose our government. Okay, now you can say that we don't, but you really have to stretch it to say that's the case. Okay? Now I've worked for other people in my life, especially when I was younger, just got out of school. But I also have started a few companies and never got fabulously wealthy or anything like that. But in both cases, I never felt that I was being oppressed by anybody. I was free to do either one at any time and pursue my education. You guys sound like the reality is staring you in the eye, but you're denying it. You're saying that we're not free because we're the most capitalistic country in the world, possibly. Okay, and yet we're oppressed. We're oppressed. Amazing. You showed 3 pictures of inauthentic art that somehow doesn't fit the socialist ideal. They're all produced in socialist countries that have extremely socialist governments. Do you have an example of any art that would be like produced by a free socialist?
Those can't be. It's impossible for those to be socialist governments. It's impossible. Absolutely impossible. Those are not democracies. Those are dictatorships. If you have a dictatorship, you cannot have a socialist system. It can't be. And these are dictatorships. This is an example of what happens when people exploit socialism.